All right, let's continue on in principles of asset allocation with a goals-based approach. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to take a little bit of learning from our behavioral finance modules to say that, yeah, some investors, rather than having a standard mean variance optimization, we might look at funding particular goals one by one. So the total portfolio is going to be the sum of the sub-portfolios, or what we might call modules, and each module then meets a specific investor goal, as well as time horizon and probability of success. So often advisors design and select from predefined modules, and they're done so with an idea towards meeting very common situations, like, for example, funding kids' college education, funding for the purchase of a first home, funding for retirement, right? Some standard things that they can compute some modules for that are optimized to meet those individual goals along those individual time horizons. So the modules themselves are created using mean variance optimization, and then basically the portfolio becomes a compilation of those modules. So then the modules are selected by the advisor then from the efficient frontier created from that mean variance optimization. So the modules basically need to meet these goals in a wide variety of fashions, right, with a very high probability. And so as a result, these modules should cover a wide range of the investment universe. If a module, we're going to say, is going to meet a particular goal of a client and it involves 100% allocation in one asset class, well, that means there's going to be some idiosyncratic risk there. It's not going to be well diversified. So we want these to cover a wide range of the investment universe, right? We want them to be sufficiently different from each other. So we don't want to use the same portfolio to fund a college education as funding retirement, right? Those are two different timelines, two different sets of goals. And so as a result, well, the modules for both should have some difference between the two. We want to recognize that some assets have some non-normal return distributions. Just like with any assumption, when we're running an optimization, we understand if we assume normality in asset returns, we're understating that left tail downside risk. They should also provide sufficient liquidity in the extent that it's needed, and also, sort of as a sub-point of that, anticipating potential panic sales by clients who want to liquidate during crisis periods. So again, the role of the manager is to go to the client and talk them out of doing that, talk them out of selling at the wrong time. However, if these modules have a certain degree of liquidity, then hopefully that allays some of their concerns, particularly when you go through some of these market downturns. So let's do an illustration of this, okay? So let's say there are 3 modules available from an investment advisor, okay? Each module has an expected return and standard deviation, so you see them there, modules A, B, and C. All right, the investor has 2 goals, okay? The first goal is they want to have $500,000 saved to fund the daughter's education beginning in 10 years with a 90% required probability of success. In other words, they want to be 90% likely to meet this goal. Okay. Next thing, they want to be able to transfer $6 million to the daughter in 30 years with a required probabilities of success of 75%. All right. So given those dollar amounts, given those probabilities, and given those time horizons, which portfolio is going to work best in these situations? All right. So how do we go about doing this? So let's say we're given some information, or we can calculate some probabilities for each portfolio to meet those goals over those horizons. So over a 10-year horizon, if we have a required success probability of 90%, it turns out that we can look at portfolio A as having the higher percentage return. If we look at a 30-year horizon, which is the other goal, which we said had a required success probability of 75%, well then we're going to look at those 3 modules and choose module C because again, it has the highest expected return during that period of time with that probability. So once we are able to convert that expected return and standard deviation into a rate of return per required success probability, then that allows us to choose between the modules as far as which one is going to be best to meet which one of those goals. Okay, so that first goal, have $500,000 saved in 10 years with 90% probability. Okay, so we looked at the rate of return with a required level of success of 90%, and so we decided, looking at that 10-year horizon, that module A is going to be the best choice because of its highest percentage there. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose module A, and so from there, looking at that percentage, we're going to say, okay, how much do we need to fund that goal today? Okay, well, that's just a simple discounting problem, right? We want to end up with $500,000. We are expecting a 3% rate of return to give us that 90% required probability of success. Just take the future value divided by 1 plus r to the power t, and that gives us a required funding level for today of $372,047. Now, how about the other goal? We want to have a 75% probability of success to be able to give $6 million to the daughter in 30 years. Okay? Now, go back to our table of data from a couple of slides back. If we look at a 30-year horizon, then what we're going to be looking at here is Module C, because with our required success probability of 75%, it was C that had the highest percentage return. Okay? So choosing that Module C with that 5% return at that probability of success, what we want to do then is take that and do another discounting problem to figure out how much they need to fund that goal today. So if the goal is to have $6 million in 30 years, well, again, that's our future value. Discount that by 1 plus r to the power t, 1 plus 5.2% raised to the 30th power. That gives us a required funding amount of $1.3 million, roughly, $1,311,231. Okay, so if we combine those together, total portfolio funding then is going to be the sum of those two present value calculations that we just did. So for the first goal, we determined that we needed to save a little over $372,000. For the second goal, the 30-year goal, we needed to save a little bit over $1.3 million. Add those two together, we decided the total portfolio funding starting today needs to be $1,683,278. So the portfolio asset allocation and return are going to be a weighted average of the module allocations and return. And so this is an idea that works really well with individuals. If you have individuals that have multiple goals that they are worried about, this gives them a tailored approach to each one. It's something that has a lot of resonance with individuals. Now, it's a little bit complex to implement because it means you have to be able to determine the client's true goals. I mean, we laid all that information out there for you as though it were easy to gather. Well, to figure out the dollar amount, the time horizon, and the required probability of success, well, that's something that's going to take a lot of communication with the client in order to try and elicit those numbers to any sort of level of exactitude. And it also may mean that you need to periodically revisit this and rebalance it because their views of these goals and the amounts of those goals and the time horizons may change over time. And so as a result, you may need to re-optimize and rebalance the portfolios. All right, some other approaches. There are some various ad hoc rules of thumb, what we might call heuristics. And so these are things that are kind of based on experience. They seem to be reasonable. They're certainly not coming out of any sort of mean variance optimization framework or any other type of optimization framework. But they are rules of thumb that a lot of people use, and they probably at least get us in the ballpark of a decent allocation. So for example, one heuristic, an allocation to equity. The percentage you allocate to equity should be equal to 120 minus your age. So if you are a 20-year-old person just starting to work, well then, yeah, that person might feel comfortable having a full 100% of their money in equities. If somebody, on the other hand, is an 85-year-old retiree, well, 120 minus 85 gives us 35%, right? It gives them a much lower equity allocation. Now, that may or may not be true, may or may not be accurate. It's going to depend upon their circumstances, their goals, their level of risk tolerance. So certainly, one heuristic does not fit all. But you could argue that it's actually a decent starting point. It might get them to at least a reasonable spot if it's not a totally optimal spot. Second thing is sort of a basic asset allocation, 60% equity, 40% fixed income for the average investor. And so again, this is not going to be one size fits all, but you do see some retirement plans start to work in this fashion. So it used to be that, for example, if you had a 401k and you agreed to put funding into that 401k, but you didn't make a portfolio allocation choice, they automatically put it all into the least risky choice. Quite often it was sort of a fixed rate annuity that had a nice guaranteed return, but very, very low. However, more and more retirement plans are recognizing that, yes, these are long-term vehicles. Having people park their money in effectively a T-bill account doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so they would say the default allocation, if they don't make a choice, is in some sort of balance fund, maybe 50% equity, 50% bonds, or 60-40. And then that way, if the employee takes a long time to actually look at this and make a decision that sort of best suits their circumstances, well, at least they have some money invested in equities, which is typically what you should be doing in your 401k plan. Next thing, some other approaches, less common ones, the endowment model. This comes from Yale. Yale was really the first university endowment to start heavily using alternative investments. We tended to think university endowments were these kind of boring, slow-moving, kind of pokey investments, and Yale turned that plan on its ear. Yale basically said, look, these are essentially perpetuities we're funding here, right? We take a little bit of money out of it each year, but probably we get more in donations each year than we're spending out of the endowment, and the rest of that money just rides for the long term. And so we're exactly the sort of investors that should be able to take on alternative investments, right? We lock up money for a few years in a hedge fund, a private equity fund. Big deal. We're not going to need that cash flow anyway. So they tended to overweight alternative investments. And again, the goal there was that they were trying to take advantage of exactly the things that alternatives claim to offer, right? Higher rates of return and an overall higher Sharpe ratio. So they could handle the liquidity risk, in fact, earn the premium for taking on that liquidity risk. And to the extent that they could pick very good alternative asset managers, then hopefully they were capturing some extra alpha there as well. Now, the problem for the rest of us, well, none of us are Yale. And so these tend to be very complex investments. So some investors are, some clients are just typically not interested in that sort of portfolio allocation. And quite frankly, it's not suitable for a great many investors. Other approach is a risk parity approach. Okay, so here we choose the allocation so that each asset class's contribution to total portfolio risk is exactly the same. Well, when we're doing this, basically we're optimizing essentially over just the risk parameter and we're ignoring expected returns. So while you could argue that there's some intuition behind an idea like this, it's not going to lead to an optimal portfolio. Then finally, the 1/n rule. Getting back to my discussion about 401k plans, this is a very common initial allocation. If somebody puts money into their 401k plan and they're on a new job, well, some people just say, hey, I'm going to contribute this money, and then they forget to allocate it, so it all gets dumped into some sort of guaranteed low rate return fund. On the other hand, some people look at the list of choices. Let's say they've got 17 different mutual funds, and they're like, I have no idea what these terms mean, what these mutual funds are doing. What do? They split their money across all 17 of those mutual funds in exactly the same amount. So we call this the 1/n rule. So you equally weight all asset classes. So it's a very naive allocation. Turns out the empirical evidence, not as bad as you might expect. Certainly better than just dumping it all into a guaranteed return fund. So certainly not optimal. However, for a naive investor that hasn't put in the time to do better, well, at least this gets them on the right track. It performs better than you might expect.